All right, we'll go ahead and get started now. There's no time like now to do it. My name is Phill Casaus. I'm the editor at the Santa Fe New Mexican. Thank you for being here today. I think we've got a very interesting discussion coming up for you. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Directly to my left is Senator Katy Duhigg. Next to her is Representative Joy Garratt. Next to her is Judy Williams of the League of Women Voters, and the guy who looks exactly the same as I do, Michael Rocca. Rocca from the University of New Mexico Political Science Department. The only thing he and I have in common is I was once a political science major at UNM, and I'm pretty sure in today's world I probably could not have gotten out of one. I was the king of the duck pond, so my chances of actually passing his class are somewhere between nil and forget about it. If you've lived in New Mexico for any period of time and you pay any attention to the legislature at all, you have heard this subject come up. And the question is should we as a state pay our legislators and create paid staff members to help them do the business of the people? That, of course, clearly has not gone as far as it could because we are not doing that at this time. My question, and I think the key question is that a good idea? And if it is, why is it a good idea? And if it isn't, what is the problem? And I'm gonna toss it over to my twin over here at the very far left to start, and then we'll go like that. We're gonna leave some time for questions at the end of this. My job as a moderator to be like a track coach. I tell everybody to get on the inside lane and run around as fast as they can. Let me know how they did when they were done. So I'm going to stay the heck out of the way, but I'm going to let you go ahead and start us, and then we'll go from there.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me for this. This is a really important concept, a really important topic, and it's been a topic of research in political science for 70 years. My colleague, Tim Krebs, who's in the crowd, who will be participating in the next panel on ethics, he and I wrote a report that was graciously funded by the Thornburg Foundation, and that will be distributed here really quickly. And we tried our best to condense 70 years of research on this topic into a readable format. It's fairly dense, but we do come to a couple really important conclusions. The basic idea of providing pay, salary, and in the scholarship, it's also another characteristic would be session length as well. So the three characteristics of what the discipline calls legislative professionalism. Now the catchword, I think, is modernization. The basic idea is providing the legislature with the capacity to do its job. And that can come in a variety of ways. The most important findings, in my opinion, would be, first of all, checking outside interests, like interest groups, having the ability to check the executive branch, having the ability to provide substantive representation, that is representation to constituents in an adequate way, being able, that is, to match the preferences and opinion and represent in those ways, to be able to provide constituency services. And I think when it comes to particularly pay, I think we've reached a point now where New Mexico has become so complicated in so many different ways, including a growing economy, demographic shifts, that the job is complex. And I think, especially when it comes to staff and salary, that it's just the right thing to do at this point. It's just the fair thing to do. It's a lot of work goes into the job of being a legislator. I'm a scholar of congressional politics, so I understand the life of a legislator, even though I've never myself been a legislator. I certainly understand it, I respect it. And I think we've reached a point now where I think it's the fair thing to do is to compensate our legislators for the job that they provide. Never mind all of the dramatic and important effects and consequences that paying, providing salary, and maybe one day changing the session length could actually do, because New Mexico still does rank at the bottom in the nation. Not at the exact bottom. We're certainly the only one that isn't paid, but when it comes to legislature, we still have among the shortest session lengths and the least staff in the entire nation. I think the scholarship would certainly suggest that it's time for that to change.
Okay, I'm going to turn it. I'm going to ask Senator Duhigg and Representative Garratt. You're in the middle of this every day. during the session and really outside the session. Where I've lived in places where they've had paid legislators. They didn't like paid legislators any more than they probably like the legislature that we have that is unpaid. So where's the advantage, and especially in the day-to-day that you all face?
You want to go? Yeah. So I think there's absolutely an advantage in that you get what you pay for. And right now, you get an amateur legislature where we don't have the kind of expertise that New Mexicans deserve. And as a result, the subject matter experts that we generally have to turn to are lobbyists or someone else who has a vested interest in whatever it is they're talking to. And so you get a better legislature, I think, when we are paid. You also get a more representative legislature. Right now, only if you're rich or retired, basically, you can afford to serve. And that wipes out a huge swath of people who would probably be really great policymakers in our state. I, unfortunately, am neither, and rich nor retired. I wish I was both. But I'm finding that I don't know if I can afford to continue to be a legislator because my income has gone down 75% since I started serving. Now, part of that is, I don't know, I'm not great at balancing the legislative work with my professional work, but it's also because I don't know how you do this job to the level that New Mexicans deserve without neglecting things like your paid work. So yes, I think there's definitely value to it. It's a real question, though, about how much it is, how you justify giving folks enough that they can not be working, having to earn a living during it, and should they be earning a living during it? I think that the devil is very much in the details.
Thank you for that great question. Two things. Most New Mexicans think we are paid. So, I get calls, Representative Garratt, what you just did really sucked. You're not worth the money you're paid. It's like, okay, I'm not paid. Secondly, the only person who answers my phone is me. So when people call, it's like, I would like you to take a message for Representative Garratt. This is not during the session. During the session, we have a legislative assistant who varies in their capacity. I will say some are great and some don't have so many skills. So when I answer the phone, they're like shocked. My main assistant is my dog at my kitchen table, I cannot train her to write emails. But there's a couple things. So I just retired from teaching. And when I was teaching, that was my salary to be a legislator, frankly. And then we have a stipend, which is the federal stipend, which pays for room and board. I debated today, I thought, Jeremy Ferris is going to be here. Can I use my campaign money to pay for my gas to get up here? Those are the kind of little things and big things. And Diana Schneider referred to some of those things. So we really need a salary. I talked to one of the Republican party leaders in the state who's a constituent, and I said, well, Robert, what do you think the salary should be? He said, well, you should be paid, and it should be the professional average, $70,000 to $80,000. Then I talked to the Republican sitting next to me at a committee last week, and he said, well, I don't like the idea of a salary, but I do like the idea of staffing, because we don't have any year-round staff. It's a patchwork quilt. We rely on some terrific work from our Senate and House clerks. They provide some of our constituent services. Matt Roybal in the governor's office is one of our caseworkers because we don't really have caseworkers. The Speaker of the House has a staff person that helps us do non-political stuff, but it's a patchwork. There's nobody that's really there dedicated to me. We get hundreds of emails every day, and some are really vital, and some are the 1,000 secure the border type, which takes 30 minutes to go through just to do away with them. And some of them are really important. Someone who has ALS and needs a wheelchair that's motorized and is only going to live for 3 months, where do we go for help? So we have things that take time to answer, to research, to find the person that can help the person. We also, something that hasn't come up is our committees need professional staff. I'm the chair of the Transportation, Infrastructure, and Revenue Subcommittee, but we don't have a year-round transportation expert. We have a terrific LFC staff member, but he's doing 3 different topics. Our committee, every time we go to our regular session, our standing committee chair has to find a staffer who can be a nonpartisan analyst. So there's our personal staff, and then there's permanent staff beyond the LASC and the LFC. Gail Chasey was thrilled. I think she got 2 paid people to help her over their interim on the massive issues with crime and justice. And then the other thing is session length. It's all over the page. We did a survey, I forget what it stands for, the Bieber Institute at the University of New Mexico. We were able to give junior money, Representative Rubio and me, and they did they did interview after interview with legislative staff, with legislators of all parties and DTS. And that full report will be released in January. An initial report was shared at CCJ last week. And, should we have longer sessions? If we get a paid legislature, should the sessions be longer? Somebody said, no, they shouldn't be longer because no matter how long, the last 3 days are gonna be intense all-nighters. Well, the problem is we need longer time to study the bills. One of our proposals is to have a recess in the middle of the session where you go back to your constituents, where you don't have committee meetings, where you can just have time to study. Somebody was, Dale Decker at the Economic Committee, I can't remember anymore, was it last week, this week? He commented, you have this $12 billion budget, and you have part-time amateur legislators who have to juggle through it. It's a massive issue. So yes, we need a paid legislature, we need paid staffing. I will add one thing, that a paid legislator, as you pronounce that so well, that would need a constitutional amendment. Changing the sessions needs a constitutional amendment. Paying staff requires a budget. It does not require a constitutional amendment. So those are some initial comments.
Judith, I'm wondering, I think one of the things that your report talked about was that while this, if we professionalize legislature, and I'm not sure I like that term, but if we modernize the legislature, that it may give an advantage to incumbents to some extent. I'm wondering if you could talk about that, and then I want to ask you, is giving an advantage to an incumbent under any format really the right thing to do?
That's a really good question. One of the effects of modernizing the legislature would be that it could create an institutional environment that advantages those who are already in power. And in many ways, in what we found in other states, and I think there's reason to believe that New Mexico might be a little different in this regard, but it actually might disadvantage racial and ethnic minority candidates or female candidates, because whatever existing institutional power structures are already in place that disadvantage those sorts of candidates, including challengers in general, would just be reinforced by how professional that legislature later becomes. I think, though, the case of New Mexico will be different for a variety of reasons. The baseline in New Mexico, in the Mexico legislature, is already higher when it comes to racial and ethnic diversity. It's already higher when it comes to female representation, and incumbents already win in New Mexico. So it's really hard to tell in the New Mexican case whether professionalizing the legislature would actually add to those challenges or just reinforce what already happens in New Mexico. I happen to think that incumbents are always have an advantage anywhere, because they've got the name recognition, they have the resources, they have the money, they have the networking, everything that you need to win re-election. And but we can't forget, and we just saw it here in 2022, we'll see it in 2020, we see it again in 2024, that incumbents can still lose. They can get primaried out, they can lose the general election. You still have to represent, you still have to do the things in order to win re-election. Incumbents run scared every single time, right? They're doing everything they can to win re-election, which requires representing at some level. So the fact that so many incumbents win re-election is not always a bad thing. I like to teach my students in UNM that if incumbents are winning re-election, they're probably doing so because they're doing a pretty good job of representing. Because if you don't do a good job, if you screw up on votes, you say something stupid, you're corrupt, and you get caught by the ethics commission, you're going to get called out by interest groups who are paying attention, and then there's going to be negative ads. You're going to lose. So the idea that professionalizing the legislature would advantage incumbents any more than they're already advantaged seems to me to be sort of a small cost to all of the added benefits that we could accrue by professionalizing the legislature, by providing staff salary, and by one day maybe increasing session length as well.
Judith, I'm wondering if that argument will play with voters and people who think that they're being paid already. I mean, if you went to the public and said, you might actually give incumbents more of an advantage, is it a loser of an issue right on that front? You deal with voters as much as anybody.
Is this on? Yes. I'll start with a comment about incumbency. Ellen Oliver of the Thornburg Foundation asked at a meeting once how many people running for office in the New Mexico House this year are unopposed. And since we do voter guides, and I was deep into Vote 411, which is our online voter guide, I went through and counted up the uncontested out of 70 candidates, out of 70 offices, 70 seats, 45 of them were uncontested in 2022, and this is with an unpaid legislature. So I don't know. I think my colleague is right. Incumbents are privileged anyway, and I'm not sure that makes a difference. Of course, we do hear, I'm not going to vote because they're all crooks and so on and so forth. New Mexico, Santa Fe, the League of Women Voters of New Mexico, is one of the good government organizations, and we believe that there is a cost to government, and that the government cost should be paid by the taxpayers. Right now, I don't think this is exactly the case in New Mexico. We have lobbyists who provide meals at committee meetings. I was at the Courts, Corrections, and Justice Committee meeting last week, and several female legislators spoke up and said, I have to use my campaign funds to support my travel around my district. Many of their districts are huge. As the ex-senator said, I ran up my credit card debt. So depending on campaign funds, lobbyists, and credit card debt, I don't think is a great way to finance a government, and that's exactly what we're doing. Things are different now than they were in 1912. So, I mean, we've got things like climate change and economy and homelessness and all kinds of things, education challenge, and many challenges and many complexities. And to have a 30-day session when you get 800 bills introduced, and then most of them die just because they run out of time or time has run out on them, is kind of it's not an effective way to run a government. And we are also, of course, bird-dogging transparency all the time. And I think effectiveness and transparency suffer when you have short sessions. You have one session that's dedicated to only certain things, depending on what individuals weigh in, and you have an unpaid legislature. And I think whether they're paid or not paid, you're going to get people saying they're all crooks, I'm not going to vote for them. And I think that's part of the public trust issue that we have to remediate. But I also think if we can say the taxpayers, we are all paying to support our legislature, instead of depending on special interests to support our legislature, that might be a step toward improving public trust.
I'm wondering if Katie or Joy, if you could talk us through something where we've talked a lot about paying the legislators, but you're very interested in staff as well. I'm wondering if you could sort of outline where, if any point in your careers at the Roundhouse where having somebody on staff, not merely and I'm not trying to denigrate this, answering emails and all of that, but somebody who can help you work through a bill or work through the work, how does that manifest itself? How could that manifest itself? It doesn't manifest itself now, you don't have that person, but how could it manifest itself and make you better legislators?
So, well, I'll thank Professor Rocca, because I tried to do an end run around staffing issues by getting one of his students to be one of my legislative aides during this interim. But really, and she's a wonderful student, but what I really needed, she couldn't provide because she's an undergraduate student, and what I really needed was an analyst. And so some of the ways that I've gone to a couple of what's the NCSL stand for? The National Conference of State Legislators. They put on meetings around the country all the time, and I've gone to a couple of them over this interim and last, and I'm always amazed when I get there, and at least a third of the people there are staff. It's not the legislators. The legislators are back in their district doing their work, and staff is there becoming subject matter experts, and they're gonna go back and educate the legislator. And I can't tell you how green with envy I am every time I go to one of these things and see that. So we could have people who, there's just not enough hours in the day for everything that we need to get done to be really effective legislators. And so the more we could have someone who has the ability to take on some of that learning, the more time we have freed up to do things like directly respond to constituents and work on bills.
Who gives you the learning now? I
Me.
mean, is it you and lobbyists and
lobbyists,
other?
Right. So for example, each interim, I like to kind of pick a topic to try to learn about. So this time I've picked CYFD. So I've spent a lot of time over this interim trying to learn as much as I can about child welfare issues in New Mexico. But it's me just going out and trying to find anyone who will talk to me. And often the people who are most willing to talk to us are lobbyists or advocates, but someone who has a vested interest in some way. I have not yet, especially on the child welfare issue, because boy, do you hear different things from CYFD versus child welfare advocates, and it's really hard to know who to believe. And I've been searching for the last 9 months or so for that one magical unicorn person who has no vested interest and can give it to me straight. And I don't know if they don't exist, but I sure haven't found them. And it's also because I don't have any more time to search for them. So.
Two things. I'm good friends with Melanie Stansberry, who came into the legislature with me, and she's doing a great job. So I said, Melanie, you're doing a great job. She says, Joy, I get a salary. I have 16 paid staff members, So we could do so much more. Today I was at the National Hispanic Cultural Center for a briefing on capital outlay programs. Simultaneously, and I went there with Senator Padilla half an hour later, we were at CNM learning about their workforce solutions and their incredible beverage system. I couldn't be two places at once. They were really important. Capital outlay, I'm in the west side of Albuquerque, and I'm, as I said, on the Transportation Committee. I could use someone who could go to the Middle Rio Grande COG meeting on transportation, who could go to the State Transportation Commission. I cannot go to all the meetings and read through all the data of the federal, state, and local funding strands for roads, something that is a huge issue in my district and a huge responsibility as the current chair and longtime standing committee member. So just having, and then, there are people out there to help us, but it takes hours to do the communicating to those people, and then having a reliable person who can get briefings. So it would multiply our effectiveness. It would almost be like having a clone, frankly.
Do you mind if I jump in real quick? Because scholarship, research absolutely backs those stories up. Greater number of staff means, first of all, the state is in a better position to innovate, to create innovative policy, not just to copy and paste from other states. And New Mexico is unique in so many ways. Copy and pasting just doesn't work. We need innovation, and that's where staff comes in. That's where expertise comes in. And then second, the staff can provide constituency services, right? And that's absolutely, they can answer phone calls, they can go out to your constituents, and they can help provide any sort of resources that your legislator, your representative, just doesn't have time to do at that moment. It was about in the middle of the pandemic when I read an op-ed from the Albuquerque Journal, and this made Professor Krebs and I head practically explode because we were in the middle of finishing this research project. The op-ed argued that why should we provide greater resources to the legislators when they can't even check the governor? And at that point, there were public health orders left and right, and the legislature wasn't particularly being active in the issue. And Professor Krebs and I read that, and we're like, this is consistently what the public, we believe, gets wrong. The causal arrow is wrong, is literally wrong in that statement. The reason that the legislature cannot check a governor and cannot check lobbyists and cannot check and interest groups is because they don't have the capacity to do so. And so it's not like, so the argument that why should we reward them, it's no. It's like they can't because they can't, because they don't have the resources to do so. So part of the argument that you're hearing here is not to reward legislators. The argument is centered on the idea that if we want the legislature to do the job of the people and to do all this checking, bureaucracies, checking interest groups, checking the government, making sure that constituencies are served appropriately, they need the resources to do it. And it means salary, and really, the most important thing, I hate to say it, salary is important, but the most important thing is staff, and then finally adjusting the session length. There are those three ways that you can do that.
Okay, so I'll ask you all, I want everybody's input on this, but what is the most effective way by which this gets done so that you can convince the voter in your district and in Santa Fe and Deming and Hobbs that this is an idea whose time is past time? How does that begin? Because it has begun many times and has died quiet deaths and loud deaths, but it has died. So how does this begin? How would you formulate this kind of campaign? How would you move this so that voters, A, understand that you're not being paid now, and B, that this is good for them?
Yeah, like Representative Garratt said, the staffing part, we don't need to worry about that on. That's just a line item. But yeah, I have real concerns that if we put this on the ballot in '24, it will fail, and it'll set us back 20 years. We need a massive public education campaign that doesn't. And frankly, I don't know that voters, when they hear, most voters, this stuff is such inside baseball. So we need to articulate why it's good for them, why it is in their best interests that this happened, that we have a professional, modern legislature. And frankly, we need the help of media in doing that. We need the help of advocacy groups. This needs to be a message that voters are getting from a variety of sources, and that they're getting consistently. And it really needs to be hammered, I think, for minimum 2 years before we try to put anything on a ballot, because I think it's just too easy to kill otherwise. It's just too easy to say, those greedy politicians want your money. Done.
One of the bills that Representative Rubio has already submitted to be drafted is to make an independent salary commission for the legislature, a binding independent, because as we saw with the election, with the redistricting commission, one of the pros and cons is that we got this incredible statewide feedback, and then the House and the Senate changed what they said. So our feeling is that, and this is kind of shown up in the survey that the UNM Rose Rohrer did, is that it needs to be a binding salary commission. So that's one thing. The second thing is, and the professor really nailed it, is the argument about the strong governor. I'm in a swing district, so in answer to your question about incumbents winning or losing, if you're in a swing district, it's grueling every single time, let me tell you. So I think it's important for our more conservative-leaning compatriots to realize that, there's all this MLG stuff. Well, if you want MLG to be balanced, you need the checks and balances strengthened. And they're not right now. The legislature, the governor works year-round with their staff. We work for our little sessions and our committees. So I think that argument is really important. As Katie and we previously said, massive education is important, and there's so many advocacy organizations that are already, Common Cause took a survey. There's great groups out there, but the legislation has to be carefully crafted down to the language if it passes, and then we have to leave it up to the people and let people know that, okay, you have to decide this on the constitutional amendment in the ballot. I think that's one way to get legislators to support it.
Judith, I'm curious what you think on this.
I think the Common Cause survey that was done recently by Research and Polling showed a surprising to many of us amount of public support for paying legislators, extending the session, and hiring staff. Although there was also a substantial number of people who thought legislators already get paid and their average salary is $75,000 a year. Yeah, they know for a fact. So I think there are many arguments to be made. They have to be distilled and made public in the right ways, and that's going to be the big challenge. Effectiveness, transparency. I mean, stop doing meetings half the night. Don't pass big bills at 3 o'clock in the morning, because the only people who are there are paid lobbyists. We're not there. I have a life. I go to bed. I think the issue of checks on the executive, I think, checks and balances are, at least when I was a political science major and undergraduate, that was one of the things. We have 3 branches of government, and they supposedly check and balance each other. And that's not as effective when you have a weak branch or when you have an overly strong branch. Both are not good for democracy. So I think it probably is going to have to be a long, hopefully not a very long, but intense campaign. And I was kind of hoping that we could do a quick and really intense campaign and get this on the ballot for the 2024 election, but I don't know that that's going to happen, given the climate. And I think people are aware of the complexities and of current government and our lives. And finally, I think if you have a paid staff and a paid legislator, I think you probably would get better constituent service. And that might be a good selling point as well.
Can I say one more thing on this point? So I think also a lot of consideration needs to go into what the actual language is that voters will see on their ballot. Because when we pass constitutional amendments, what we pass through the legislature might be 20 pages. All you see is the title. So all the voter ever sees on a constitutional amendment is the title. And so those titles need to be crafted, I think, very delicately in a way that voters understand what they're voting for, but can also see the value and the utility of what they're being asked to vote for. Because I think there's been a tendency in the past when this issue has come up to basically try to craft it in a way that we're going to trick voters into voting for this. And I don't like that. I don't like that approach. I think the public should know what it is they're voting on.
Okay, we're gonna open this up to questions from the audience. If you've got a question, I think we've got a microphone somewhere that will be coming to you. And my friend here in the front it was the quick draw hand raiser there, so she's gonna go first.
Hi, I'm a former legislator from Oregon, so I'd love to join your efforts. I have so many ideas for each of the issues you mentioned, but my question is, you mentioned one bill that I think you said Rubio is going to be offering, and certainly that idea is something that NCSL has promoted heavily and did a big survey. You probably saw in the NCSL magazine, it was the front cover of it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I still have that. So if you want a copy of that, I'm happy to give it to you. So it sounds like that's going to be introduced, and then it also sounds like maybe you're shying away from introducing a constitutional amendment that would be put on the ballot in 2024. You kind of hinted at that, but I'm kind of curious, what is the plan right now for this 2023 session?
Well, thank you, great question, and thank you for your past service. Think of running again. Wherever I go, I recruit, you know. You're a first grader, I'm on it. So the first one we're working on is to establish a binding commission to set legislative salaries, and we talked with Jeremy Ferris, I believe, about not having that be the ethics, because it's a whole nother area. So that is what we're going to be presenting. And we're working on it still. We're still drafting it, we're still working on it. So that's one thing. The second thing is to do legislation about paid staff, not a constitutional amendment, but line items. So we have several people working on it. And the third thing, which I don't know if we'll present or not, but paying a salary is related to session length and expectations. One person who gets a nice salary said, well, I wouldn't want to quit my job to get the salary until he realized that we're talking about possibly a real salary, plus your stipend for room and board and your one round trip per session, which nobody does one round trip. So, you know, everything, it's all related. It's all interconnected. We're hopeful about a lot of it.
And while I'm nervous about putting it on the 24 ballot, I don't think that's any reason to hold off on pushing an amendment overall during this session, because we can specify what ballot it goes on. It doesn't. If we don't specify it, will automatically go on the next general election ballot. But we could specify 26 or whenever we want.
Sir, right in the middle there.
Yeah, a question for Professor Rocca. If I recall right, what happened in California was that they decided to pay their legislators, and they paid them good, hefty salaries. And as I recall, the verdict that came out was that while there may have been a lot of good things about that, one thing that it did not do, and this goes back to the prior conversation we had at the beginning of the session, it didn't stop corruption. Political corruption continued at the same pace. I'm not sure if it got worse or not, but I wonder if you would comment on that. Am I right about that?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, and I'm going to defer to my colleague Tim Krebs on that question just a second, because he literally studies California. But I do have one thought on that, and this is something that Alan broached with us just as a research topic a couple weeks ago. Would be, it's really important to think about how professionalism and the rules that govern professionalism in a state legislature interact with other rules. And one of the most important things that happened, I think, around that time period in California that might have complicated this corruption idea is they also instituted really intense term limits. And so what you have then is you have two different institutional rules working against one another. You have one that is encouraging professional legislators while also discouraging experienced legislators. And so as that level of experience drops, so you have a bunch of rookies come into office all of the time because they get term limited out, you are essentially undercutting everything that you've done by providing staff and salary in all these other directions. Tim, I mean, do you have any follow-ups on that?
Hello?
Yeah.
You know,
I don't think we know yet the connection between sort of term limits and corruption, but I mean, it's absolutely true. The California legislature is highly professionalized. It's like the U.S. Congress. I was a staff member before I went to graduate school a long, long time ago, and it was, it's a highly professionalized kind of thing. I'm sorry? Oh, can I stand? Oh, okay. So I don't think we know the connection necessarily between term limits and corruption, but I think, the problem is, you do have this sort of professionalization on the one hand, which is really good, but I think in California, what you have are sort of ethics commissions or the Fair Political Practices Commission that they don't have. There's not a lot of teeth to what they're doing. So you've got to have these things together. You've got to be able to enforce the law. You've got to have adequate disclosure laws. You've got to be able to have transparency in all of these processes. But if you don't have a mechanism by which to really sort of enforce things, you're going to, in a sort of regime of enforcement, you're going to have a really difficult time trying to fight corruption. And so that's. I think that's a big part of it. Is that part of this?
One of the arguments in favor of paying California legislators was that it would stop corruption. Once you pay them, then they're not as liable to be paid as well.
Yeah, and there's yeah, exactly. And so I mean, it's like what Tripp was saying earlier. There are human beings, and there's an opportunity. It's a selection process. If you have sort of a weak sense of ethics going into the process, and you're susceptible to this kind of behavior, well, you're going to do it. And so there are other sort of checks on that too. At the local level, for example, we see. There's a lot of corruption, but we don't have really a strong sort of media presence at the local level, oftentimes investigating what local officials are doing. And so, people are kind of under the radar screen. And so, they take advantage of situations.
Okay, we got time for about 2 more questions. Ma'am, go ahead. Oh, we need the mic. Sure, of course.
There are 2 committees that have paid staff, and that's the Legislative Education Study Committee, and this year just approved yesterday in the LHHS committee, Senator Hickey, I think it's EY, they endorsed a bill to ask for paid staff for legislative Health and Human Services interim. And there was an appropriation for this interim committee session for $350,000 to help with paid staff for the interim, but I don't think that they used all of the money. That's some of the thoughts. Thank you.
And it's definitely baby steps towards the right direction.
Okay. Go ahead, sir.
Perhaps you can make a suggestion for an argument, because all I ever hear from all across the state for decades now, in every socioeconomic group and every industry, from agriculture to mining to aerospace, everything, medical field, there's a consensus that people do not want a paid legislature because of the perception, somebody brought up corruption, but that they don't want a professional career politicians being there all the time. They like the Jeffersonian idea of the yeoman farmer coming in and doing his bit and going back home. And you could point out the benefits to them from the staff, which you get a lot of support for, but there's just a real hard opinion that people don't want in New Mexico, with a state of only 2 million people, paid professional career politicians in the legislature. What's an argument to rebut that?
I have no idea. Well, again, I go back to you get what you paid for. And people hate politicians. It's kind of like lawyers. Everyone hates lawyers till you need one. And everyone hates politicians until they want something done in their community or a policy change or something. And so I think, again, in response to positions like that, we have to be able to clearly identify to voters how this benefits them and why this is good for them and their communities, and not and take the focus, frankly, off of us as much as possible.
And I think, again, it's that education piece. People don't know we're not paid. They don't know what they're missing. And we need a massive education. And then the voters have to decide, because polling is showing an increased awareness that it's needed. And the ultimate poll is the voters of New Mexico. So I think we really have to pass legislation and give it to the voters.
The logic between, just really fast, I'm not sure, I've got to think very carefully about this. I'm not sure I understand the link between salary and corruption. Seems like if a legislator is not getting paid, there's more room for corruption. Yeah. And which is exactly what seems like it's been happening in New Mexico for 150 years, or well, at least 60 years. Yeah, so it seems like that it's the reverse relationship is more likely than paying legislators is going to lead to greater corruption. I've got to think through that a little bit.
Okay. Tripp, I think we're at time. Am I right?
Oh, yes, right. Actually, this could go on for another few hours,
It
right?
could.
Thank you very much, everyone up there. It's a great panel.
Thank you.
We're going to take another 10-minute break as we